Excited to be here. My name is Maria. We're going to give folks just another 1 minute or so to join, and then we will get started. So in the meantime, feel free to hang out in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from and what your organization is up to. This is also where we're going to be taking up questions throughout the presentation, and then we've left some Q&A time at the end as well. Okay, I think this is it, and now we're going to get going. So as I said, my name is Mariya Yurakova, and I am the CEO of Charity Search Group. We are a nonprofit recruitment firm specializing in helping the nonprofit sector find talent, whether that's at the executive and leadership level or sometimes even more junior roles. We work primarily with small and medium-sized nonprofits, so we understand sort of the gravity of the situation when it comes to a transition for a leadership role on small teams. I have had the privilege of placing more than 200 nonprofit leaders across a wide variety of nonprofits. And that's on top of all the recruitment that I've done in-house as well. I'm a fundraiser at heart. I spent 15 years as a professional fundraiser and raised over $20 million for nonprofits. So that is usually the one types of role that I'm most excited about recruiting sometimes. When it comes to recruiting for the nonprofit space, I work a lot with boards when they're trying to transition an executive director or CEO hire. And so I've been in the room and talked to many board members and walked them through what that hiring decision should look like, which sometimes it's about the hiring decision and sometimes it's about the state of the organization and where we're trying to go. I spent a long time publishing and speaking in the nonprofit sector and advocate greatly for a nonprofit talent because I think we have a depth of that in the industry, but I also know that things can be very challenging when it comes to trying to hire the right person for the role. I think I already covered a little bit of what we do, but Charity Search Group has had more than 120 placements over more than 25 states. We work nationwide and we have a 98 completion rate. Well, basically what that means is that, 98 out of 100 times we will get a hire. Occasionally we would have an internal candidate or during the pandemic, a lot of organizations decided not to hire, and that's the only time we would eventually conclude without having a successful candidate join an organization. So we tend to be pretty persistent when it comes to staying with an organization and evolving with them as they are thinking around a hire changes as well, which is very typical, especially for executive director roles. So why are we here and why are we talking about succession planning, which is something that I'm very passionate about? One of the reasons why that is the case is because many times a hire for an executive director sort of gets dropped in the lap of the board of directors with 30 days, 3 months notice. It's saying someone who's been there for 15 years and is ready to move on. And then everyone is focused on the replacement of that particular person, but it doesn't always allow the time to think through the needs for the entire organization a bit more globally. And so engaging in succession planning, whether you need it today, 3 months from now, or 3 years from now, is always a good exercise to ensure that you're ready and you don't feel rushed and it doesn't feel like you're hiring with an urgency when that time comes, and you can be more thoughtful, more deliberate about how you communicate about the role, how you think about what the needs are, and what other considerations you need to give. Now, that being said, currently, recent surveys show that 2 out of 3 executive directors of small and medium-sized nonprofits are ready to move on. And so many of them are retiring, and many of them are just ready to move on because they held on to their roles with a particular organization during the pandemic, and now they want a new challenge. So many organizations are finding themselves in a need to replace their leaders. Another stat that I want to bring to everyone's attention is just how difficult a transition is when an executive director who's been with the organization for a very long time, especially if they founded it or they started it, for example, even if you find a great hire, that particular hire usually has a hard time with all the changes that goes on in the organization. They don't last very long. So spending a lot of time planning and thinking through what needs to happen in the organization with a new leader will help transition that new person a little bit better so they stay longer, because 18 months for an executive director is not long enough. And because everybody's ready to leave, there's also a lot of executive director vacancies in the market. So anyone who's qualified to be an executive director tends to have their pick. So that makes for a very competitive hiring market for executive directors. Things are moving a little bit faster than boards would like them to. Organizations are having a hard time taking the time to figure out what is it that they need in their next leader. And many times boards are hiring an executive director for the first time. So if you think about it, it's the most important role in an organization. And many times the people that have to make the decision have never done it before. And so it's a tough spot to be in, and it's very difficult to get it right. Lots of things can go wrong. So I'm hoping that today we can spend some time thinking through what this process should look like, and maybe planting some seeds about things that you may want to do with your own organization, whether you're leading it or whether you're a board member on an organization, so that you can start thinking through this process for when it's needed. It doesn't have to be needed tomorrow. Some factors when it comes to a successful leadership transition and sort of how to get things right. The engagement of the board is really, really important. And that's probably step one. The more engaged and the more sort of dialed in the board is with the daily goings on of an organization, the better usually the more informed their opinions are, and the better hiring decision they're able to make. The more internal talent you're able to develop, and the stronger leaders you have across the organization, not just the executive director level, usually a little bit easier because it's less risk to manage if you're just moving on from the one most capable person and everybody else is not ready to step up, for example. And then succession planning, like lots of organizations, when a leader leaves, that's when questions are being asked. Are we doing the right thing? Do we want to scale? Do we want to grow? Do we want to maintain? Do we have things fixing? So asking those kinds of questions early on and on an ongoing basis puts a little bit less pressure on that hire. So it's good to have those discussions on a regular basis. And then stakeholder communication is really important. So the biggest risk for a nonprofit when an executive director leaves or is about to leave is the risk that could carry for all the relationships that they've developed. So in the information and the knowledge gathering that needs to happen, that sometimes is just in people's heads. But also the risk for potential funding to go away is also one. And just not knowing what the executive director has been doing for 10, 15 years tends to carry a lot of risk. So it's really important that you have a plan as to how you communicate with folks, both internally and externally, to make sure that like two things I usually hear are, oh, if the executive director is leaving, then I'm going to leave too. So that's typically happens with other long tenured employees in the organization, and then that's makes life even more difficult. Or on the flip side, when the executive director leaves, are all our funders and donors going to leave as well? That's the other sort of a fear that lots of organizations have. So thinking through how you communicate to prevent that or minimize it is really important. And then you get to the point where you need to hire someone. So before you even get to the point of hiring, there's lots of other things that need to happen in the meantime. Typically, our clients come to us when they think that they're ready to hire. But many times they haven't necessarily done steps 1 through 4. It's just that the executive director is given notice and now they feel the urgency to replace them without having a lot of time to think through these other steps. So when it comes to board engagement, like a few things that I think are really important, and I try my best to hold boards accountable to this, is the most important role of the board is to hire the executive director. Everything else the board does is great, but they have to get the hiring process right, and they have to be involved, and they have to be focused on this process. The most important role of the current executive director is to make sure that you have a board that's trained and recruited to be able to execute on that task. And it sounds self-explanatory, but typically what I see happen, especially in situations where there isn't a strong tenure of leadership transition. So an organization that's very young that has had maybe one or two executive directors in its entire history, or they've had only one executive director and the entire board has been staffed by the same 5 people for 10, 15 years that don't necessarily do a ton because they have full 100% trust into the executive director to execute on things. And so in those situations, what happens is the board is just not ready. They don't know what they're looking for. They don't have a good grasp on what the organization is up to, and they're definitely not ready for the 30 to 40 hours of time that it's going to take to hire a new person. So if you're currently an executive director, I think it's really important that you take some time to do some capacity building with the board to make sure that they know how to do this work and they are fully aware and they understand that this is part of their responsibilities and probably the most important thing they need to do. So a couple of things that I think are must-haves that make things a little bit easier. Board terms, especially ones that expire. Even if you can renew people, I think it's important to give them the understanding that their board seat is not forever. Understanding what everybody brings in terms of skills to the board and where there may be gaps. So for example, I've worked with boards where everybody's a subject matter expert on whatever the organization's mission is, but nobody is an expert in finance, nobody's an expert in HR, and nobody's an expert in marketing, for example. So you want to make sure that you have a bit of a mix. And if there is a gap, then you want to take the time to recruit someone new to balance that out. And give-gap policies, I think, are really important as just a general approach to boards. And then clear terms of responsibilities and duties. Understanding, is this a governance board? Is it a working board? If it is a working board, how are they engaging with this? I think things get really tricky. And one of the main complaints that I hear from both executive directors and staff is when the board tends to get in the weeds of how to do the work, and then staff spends more time managing their expectations as opposed to actually doing the work. So it's a fine balance there. But I would say that's one thing that I would notice. And as a general rule, I think 2 to 4 hours of professional development and board training, capacity building a year is probably a good thing to do. So if you are currently a board member and you're thinking, what can I do to support succession planning? Some things, what is a give-gap policy, Veronica? I'm happy to answer that. So a give-gap policy usually means that an organization has a policy and an expectation that every board member will contribute financially to the organization with a personally significant amount. And so sometimes those are very spelled out, sometimes they're a range, sometimes they're a minimum. And if they're not able to give at that level themselves, then they are committed to raising that from their networks. So I've seen the lowest give-gap policy I've seen is 1,000, and the highest I've seen is 150,000. So it varies. I think typical is usually about 5. It depends on how large your board is, whether you have a local or a national organization and a whole bunch of other things. But your fundraising director will greatly thank you. Or if you are an executive director that doesn't have one, then you're trying to rely on the board for fundraising, give-gap policy is a good way to advance that and at least communicate the importance of it, I would say. Okay, so back to board members and sort of what can they do to participate in the succession planning process. I think identifying the short and the long-term goals of the organizations. So again, are you trying to steady the ship? Are you fixing things? Are you growing the organization? And sort of what are you trying to do? Are you local organization? Are you trying to go national? Like all of those kinds of questions. Typically, you would go through them in sort of a formal strategic planning process, but it's the board that needs the responsibility to have a vision as to where the organization is going. And it's really important to understand that before you hire a new executive director so that you can communicate that and also look for someone with the skill set and the experience to do that. Leaders come in different shapes and sizes. And so sometimes it's a question of, are they a fixer? So if you have someone who wants to come in and understand how to fix an organization's financials, for example, that happens every once in a while. Like that's great, but if you have someone who you're recruiting with that skill set and your organization actually is in a great financial space and you need someone who's going to scale things, that may not be the type of leader that you need. So it's important to ask those questions as to where are you now and where you're trying to go as an organization to understand what kind of skill set you're looking for in your next leader. Now, all of that also comes on the back end with well, you need to evaluate the performance of the current executive director and have a very good handle on what's working and what's not working, where the strengths are, how they've managed to address their areas that they're not as interested in or they don't have the time to do. Because when a new leader comes in, you want to be able to have some of that information. So often before I take on clients, I tend to ask the question, are you looking for your current executive director 2.0? Or are you looking for something completely different? Because if you're just looking for a carbon copy of your current executive director, that's really difficult to find. It makes for a tough hiring process and it doesn't set someone up for success. But you can't really answer that question unless you've taken the time to understand what the current executive director is good at, what they like to do, where they've spent the majority of their time, what they've been their accomplishments, what are some of the things that they haven't been able to get to because they can't, they don't have the skills to do so. They don't want to, whatever the case is, right? And then the one, again, it's all about mitigating risk here. Understanding where your funding is coming from, how dependent it is on individual relationships connected to the executive director or not. But I think that's really, really important. One story I can share, there was an executive director of an organization we worked with who had been with the organization for 19 years. And their funding model was such that they were relying primarily on reimbursements from several different government programs. And it turned out that the executive director hadn't been really good at submitting the reimbursements on a whole bunch of these programs. Many of them had lapsed, and it put the organization in a position where they actually had to give some of the money back because they hadn't spent it the right way, they hadn't reported on it properly. Anyways, suffice to say, funding and finance was a mess, which took the transition team 6 months to figure out how to get back on track. So you don't want to be in that situation, but it starts with really understanding what are the major funding sources, how stable are they, how can board members support some of these relationships to ensure that they're not sort of dependent on a single person. And then talk to staff. One of the areas that I see, which is always a very interesting, and it always starts like this. So I would talk to the board and they'll be like, oh, I think the staff is doing great. We don't really need to involve them in the executive director search process. And then we would survey the staff to ask them how things are going. And then 10 things will come up that they want, that the board is completely unaware that those are issues in the organization. And so, yes, the executive director is there to be the conduit between the staff and the board, but also it's important for the board to talk to staff and have an open line of communication so that they understand what the sort of maybe the potential roadblocks or what are some of the pain points that day-to-day operations has. And it's really important to hear that from the people who are actually doing the work. And then budget for some of these changes that are going to happen. So budget for a search firm if that's what you're going to need. Budget for the fact that you're going to have some vacancies. So folks will leave. You may need some interim support here and there. And then obviously budget for professional development. That's professional development when it comes to board training. It could also be professional development when it comes to staff that you're trying to skill up to take on more responsibility. But in general, think through some bucket of funds that you could use for some of this because it's a little bit unexpected, but it needs to happen. Now, if you're the current executive director, again, you want to make sure your board is balanced and has different set of skills and different perspectives. You need to write a succession plan and an onboarding or standard operation procedures plan for that knowledge transfer. Things should not be all in your head. I would say that's really important. And then engage the board in sort of short and long-term planning. So yes, annual reports are great. And if the organization is moving in the right direction, that's great. But every once in a while, you should always make sure that you have at least 3 to 5 years trajectory as to where you're trying the organization to go. And I think board needs to understand what the overall mission and sort of how you're advancing it, rather than just like the daily ongoings of what did we do in quarter 1, 2, 3, and 4. Communicate with the board on current staff strength. So just like how you should have a matrix of skills when it comes to the board, you should probably do that internally for other staff as well. One question that often comes up is there an apparent internal candidate that could potentially step into the executive director role? 99% of the time, the board will say, oh no, there's nobody strong enough internally to be able to do that role. And then we would go through the recruitment process and 3 people internally would put their hand up and be like, I would like to be the next executive director. So clearly not a ton of communication is happening there. And so I think it's important to identify, here's what our leaders are really good at, here's what we need to staff up, and here's what we need to train on. I think that's really important. And then give ample notice. I think the most jarring example I can think of in this, I have many stories of working with boards, was a prospective client that came to me and said, we had a board meeting. The executive director requested a salary increase. The board said no. She gave us 10 days notice. It's day 9 now, and she's gone tomorrow. You don't want to be in that situation. It's also not the right way to leave an organization. Now, the reality is that it does not matter whether you give a board 2 months notice or 4 months notice or 7 months or 18 months notice. A lot of this stuff doesn't get activated until sort of the last 3 months of the process, sometimes the last 30 days. And that's not enough time to get hiring right if you don't already have a whole bunch of these other foundational blocks in place. So give as much notice as possible, but also make sure that your organization is able to function and to work without much notice anyways, because reality is that you may give them notice and they may decide not to do much about it. And then the last note I would say about executive directors is that when you're ready to leave an organization, actually leave the organization. Think of the other way around. If you were joining a new organization, how would you feel if the outgoing executive director all of a sudden became a member of the board, was signed on as a consultant, hung around with staff still, or whatever the case is. So I think when you're ready to go, you should actually leave, because it's very difficult to transition in a new leader when the old one hasn't quite left yet. I think that makes things very messy. And I'm tempted to make some comments about political transitions, but I won't. Okay. So when it comes to sort of how the first step of succession planning is to really go through understanding what skills and talent is available internally, and identifying what are some critical positions we need to make sure are not vacant, what skills are necessary on the leadership team, what's the executive director good at, where do they need help, is there someone that can step in as an interim AD? And I think that's a question every organization needs to ask regardless, because anything can happen tomorrow. So we want to make sure that you have a succession plan in case of emergency, short term, and then of course transitioning a little bit long term as well. But I should also mention that succession planning is not only for executive directors. It is also for critical positions, whether they're leadership positions. Sometimes it could also be a succession plan for your office manager if that's someone that's really important to the organization, has been with it for a long time. So always thinking through what roles are really important so that the organization can move forward, even if they are in flux, and how do you staff up and prepare for that. Are there vacancies in hard to fill positions which could put pressure on operations? So I see this a lot, for example, with organizations that have a direct service delivery model. So counseling comes to mind. When they have a vacancy for a clinical director, for example, that puts a lot of pressure on the organization, and those are tough to fill roles. So it's hard to get them filled very quickly. But you can imagine what that feels like if your executive director is stretched too thin, they've given notice, and you have a vacancy for a clinical director, then that creates a big hole in the organization when it comes to operations. So you want to make sure that you are also mindful of what other roles besides the executive director are really important to the organization. And then when it comes to the leaders that you have, well, what stage in their professional journey are they on? Are they learning the role because they're new? Are they growing in the role because they've been in there for a few years? Or are they really excelling in sort of a self-motivated, able to do everything on their own because they've been with the organization, they have a strong skill set? And like, what are they really good at that if they had an executive director that knew nothing about it, they would still do pretty well? I think that's important things to think about. And then succession plan for long-term employees is a must. Again, it doesn't have to be just the executive director, but generally, if you've had someone who's been with the organization for, I would say, 6 to 10 years, you always want to make sure that you have a succession plan in place, because Those are the types of roles where we see movement quite a bit. Okay. So again, you should have a clear succession plan in place to ensure a smooth transition when it does happen. And identifying potential successors internally, I think, is one aspect of this. And then if you have someone who could get there, but they're not quite there, can you train them up? Because you're always better off promoting from within than you are having to go and find a new leader. So what I often suggest to organizations where they have someone internally that could potentially do it, for example, is to put them in that position on an interim basis, make sure that you backfill or you complement their current duties to ensure that they're not doing two people's jobs, because that's not setting them up for success either. And then if you do have 6 or 12 months of a runway, then thinking through what professional development opportunities can you invest in to ensure that they're ready to take on the role on a permanent basis if you decided to do that. And I will tell you from experience, the simple math is that professional development for someone that needs to learn staff management or leadership skills and wants to learn it, and it's in a headspace to be able to do that, is always cheaper than having to go through the entire process of hiring someone new. So just a thought there in terms of how important that is. And then the knowledge transfer is really important. So here's how not to do a knowledge transfer. I often see this with the executive directors who've been the only executive director for a really long time. Many things are in their heads, and then a new person comes on board and all they do is just talk. And they expect this other person to take notes and document the entire process on every SOP that happens about the operation of the organization. That's really not helpful. Nobody can absorb that kind of information just drinking from a fire hose. And also, I think you're prone to forget things. You don't reflect, and it doesn't allow for discussion. So document your processes as you go along. I think that goes a very, very long way. Okay, this is a good time for you to start thinking through some questions and start popping them in the chat. Sonia will help us troubleshoot these as we go through, but we're about halfway through, so I want to make sure that if things are popping up on your mind, you're not going to forget them by the time we get to the Q&A. So feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll take them up in a few minutes as well. So what's an ideal timeline for succession planning? Usually about a year to 2, if you have that. And you want to always start with internal candidate evaluation at any point in that process. The team structure is really important and sort of where people fit. And then keeping in mind that you got to keep the main thing. So whatever the mission of the organization is, it still needs to move forward. Things still need to happen, even if you're going through this transition. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you stop doing what you're currently doing and then you just focus on transitioning. I mean, kind of see this happen sometimes, especially with very small organizations where one person decides to leave and then all of a sudden programming goes on pause until they find someone else to run it. So you don't want that to be the case, because every nonprofit, and the reason why we service them is because they have great service in to address community needs. And so you don't want to interrupt that because you're affecting folks that really need those services. So making sure that you're able to keep the main thing, whatever that is, while you go through a transition, I think is important. And then that knowledge and relationship transfer, relationships, particularly when it comes to funders, collaborators, strategic partners, etc. And then you have to evaluate the current leader. I think that's one area that can get a little sticky, because sometimes it's also emotionally charged. And it's not, evaluating a current leader doesn't necessarily mean you need to criticize their work, but you need to have a pretty good understanding of what's being accomplished and what is sort of on the back burner, and why, and how to address that. And then strategic planning or organizational needs assessment, I think, is really important to go through as an exercise at some point. The best leadership transitions that I've worked on that usually go very smoothly is when there is a strategic plan that's relatively current. So like, let's say a year old, for example, with specific KPIs that have been put in place. And then there is either a succession plan or a long-term vision or something to identify where the organization is trying to go. Potentially an interim executive director has been brought in, either an external one or someone internally has been elevated in that role. I think that's usually when you set someone up for success. And then get a firm handle on finances. I can't stress this enough. Like 990s are great. We read them all the time. They tell you about 10% of the story. So really understanding what the main funding sources are, what's the long-term and short-term risks there? Are there any? What does the reserve look like? What are you spending the majority of your money in? Do you anticipate some of these things going off handle for whatever reason? Like if you're renting your building that your organization is in, like when does this lease expire? Is it going to go up? Do you need to change locations? Like all that kind of stuff is really important. I worked with on a ED search for a small organization, and we were bringing a candidate on site for a tour and an interview, and their building flooded the night before. So you can imagine when this candidate walked in, I was doing a debrief after, like, I think we're going to need to look for a new location. I was like, yeah, you're probably right. But now that all of a sudden became a task that nobody was anticipating in the process. It doesn't have to be a flood that happens, but I think it's important to understand where could potential risks be. Okay. Stakeholder communication. So I'm a firm believer in transparency. We never engage in confidential searches. So I think that's for many reasons, but one of them is because the more transparent you are with everyone, I think the easier things are. So don't be afraid to tell people that the executive director is leaving, but of course, don't just say that. You also have to communicate, here's the plan as to how we're going to address this, right? So that succession plan helps with a little bit, like what are you communicating externally at what point? What are some of those relationships that need to transition in the meantime, etc. So thinking through how you're going to communicate to staff internally, and then to external stakeholders as well, and who they are, I think is really important to make a list and think about, like, what are the partners we work with very closely? What are the funders that are really important to the organization? Broadly, how are we going to communicate this, I think is important. And then at some point you may want to do a public announcement. And then, you know, one good way to transition things mentally and emotionally for everyone is also to have sort of a, we're going to give the executive director an award. If you're an organization that does that, here's when we're going to do their farewell. So sometimes that coincides with like a major fundraising event that folks have, or a conference or something like this. But have a clear idea of how you're going to exit that person, how you're going to recognize them for their contributions, and then make sure that they feel good about exiting, right? That's a good way to transition folks. Okay. And then again, staff is important to engage at every part of the process. I think, so we typically see about 30% turnover in staff when a leader leaves and a new one comes in. That sometimes is just natural transitions because nobody likes to have a new boss anyways. People who've also been long-term employees are now thinking they gotta exit anyways. So some of that is natural, and then some of that is just adjustments from different leadership styles and sort of folks who internally applied for the role, didn't like it, that they didn't get it, that kind of stuff. But anticipate that you will experience a slightly higher turnover in staff when you transition an executive director. And then how are you going to deal with that, right? And then board engagement and making sure the board is dialed in. And like, I wouldn't say that you need to have a search committee on standby, but you do need to have a succession plan in place, and you need to identify like how many board members are going to be involved in the hiring process, and making sure that you have like a good amount of skill sets on that. I think the hardest thing for us when we engage with an organization is when they don't have a ton of board members that have the time to dedicate to this process, and it is time consuming. And so then it becomes hard because you're only relying on two people's opinions because they're the only two people that show up. And that's not a good way to go about hiring. And then donors and clients, or whoever the organization services, I think is also important to engage in the process. All right. So after you've done all of that work and you potentially have a plan, you have a long-term vision, you've figured out internally how things are handled, you may or may not have some internal folks who are interested in the role, then you actually have to find a new leader. And that process in and of itself can be very involved. This is what we do day in, day out. Never a dull moment. But I think what really helps is you really want to make sure that you understand what your vision is, and then you find candidates that have the skills and qualifications to deliver on that vision. Passion for the mission, I think, is one area that a lot of times we see folks come in and say, we really want to make sure that the candidates that we bring in really understand what we're about, and they're very passionate about our mission. Sometimes it's like they have lived experience with the work that we do. I think that's great. But that should not come at the sacrifice of actual skills and qualifications, because the thing about passion for the mission is that it's great to have that. I think on some level, it's hard to work for an organization if you're not interested in the work that they do. Most of the time, people self-select if that's the case. However, if you were really deeply passionate about the role, but you don't actually have the mechanics of being a good administrator, you're not going to be an effective executive director. You may be an effective spokesperson for the organization, but you're not going to be an effective ED. So a good example, I see this a lot in like healthcare or health-based organizations, where they'll bring someone who's an expert in whatever the work is. And so they really want to tinker with programming. They want to be out there and advocate and sort of knowledge gather about the work that the organization does. But what the organization actually needs is someone who's really skilled as funding the work that they do. And so really fundraising is a skill set that they need more. So those are the types of discussions. And I think it's important to have that ahead of time, because when you start meeting candidates, it's very difficult to not get swept into the aura of people who really get you. And then again, ensuring a strong fit for effective leadership, and sort of understanding not only what does the board want, but also what does the staff need, and sometimes what does the staff want as well. So again, board engagement, a firm understanding of strategic direction. You have to make a choice. Are you going to go on your own and try and do this? Are you going to hire a search firm to do that? Do you have an internal HR team that can lead this or not? Questions you need to ask. The glass cliff phenomenon, I'm going to touch upon in a minute. Operate with a lot of transparency. I think that's really important. Sometimes like people feel like the hiring needs to be like very cloak and dagger, and it is not. I think the more public and the more open you are with stakeholders about what you're looking for in your potential hire, I think, and you can deliver on that and you hold yourself accountable, the easier it is to justify hiring decisions and to set someone up for success. So that's where the glass cliff comes in play is. So what usually happens, and I see this sometimes with organizations that have been run by the same person for a very long time, and let's say they service marginalized communities, but that executive director happens to have no lived experience. And so the board comes to us and says, we really want to make sure that the next leader that we get is representative of the community the organization services. Okay, great. Totally understand. This is what we excel at. So we're happy to do that. But the first question I have is, how are you going to set this person up for success? Because what's the state of the organization? What are everyone's expectations? And is it possible for someone to deliver on all those things? Because there's no point in us bringing someone into an organization and then setting them up for failure because expectations are really hard, funding has been unstable, or whatever else is going on. There's no transparency, the staff's really unhappy, whatever. So I think it's really important that if you're going to sort of want to switch directions in some way, you're setting the next person up for success and not putting so much pressure on them to deliver in a very complicated environment. And then the recruitment timeline, ideally 6 to 12 months. Now, I will say from experience, no one ever gives us 6 to 12 months. Most of the time, we are lucky if we get 4. We can do recruitments really fast, but that all depends on how available the board is to interview. And trust me, you never want to, as a board, commit to being very available for interviews in the months of July and August. I think many a board have come, only one's ever delivered on being available. And even that was a little bit tricky. And then if you are a board member and you want to be part of the search committee, realize you're going to have to spend 30 to 40 hours of this over the period of 3 months, 6 months, however long, right? That sometimes determines availability as well. Okay. And then this is the last point I'm going to make is around cultural and emotional transitions. And I should probably have started with this, but I can't stress this enough. It is really, really hard to change is hard for humans in general, But when you are transitioning leaders, it's difficult emotionally for everybody. It's difficult for the leader that's leaving the organization. It's difficult for the board that has to find a new leader. And it's difficult for the new leader to come in and try to follow into someone else's footsteps that they don't know. They haven't spent a ton of time with. They don't know the history of the organization. Sometimes they get saddled with decisions they disagree with. So change is hard for everybody. But I think it's really important to recognize that it's, as a board, it's your job to find a new leader. And if that means that you need the existing executive director may not have been as effective in a certain area, you need to come to terms with that. They may be the greatest person on earth and they probably have advanced the organization and done great work, but you have to be honest with yourself as to, you know, if you had to do it again, are they the best fit for the job? And maybe they are, maybe they aren't, right? And they may be absolutely fantastic, and you need to realize that it's taken them over a decade to get there. And so whoever you get is going to have some ramp up period, and you can't have the same expectations of them on day 2 as you have from an executive director who's been with the organization for a decade. So just giving folks a lot of grace, but understanding that different people will do things differently and doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but also being a little bit more open and honest with what your current executive director is being able to deliver, how they're going to exit the organization, I think is really important. And having a succession plan doesn't necessarily mean that you got to use it right away. So sometimes a lot of executive directors don't want to take the board through the plan of having a succession plan because they don't want to give the signal that they're ready to leave, because that may not be where they are. So I think just in general, having a succession plan, regardless of whether you've walked in the role yesterday or you've been in it for a decade, I think is important to do, but understanding that it doesn't automatically mean that you're ready to leave. And then you have to, as the current executive director or as the board, you need to really understand what role do you want the current executive director to play in the hiring process. And that could be, I don't want to have anything to do with it. And sometimes I've seen this with boards. It's like, how about you go find yourself a replacement, then just tell us who they are and then we'll approve it. That's also not a way to go. And so it's somewhere in there, there's an opportunity. We go through this process with our clients where we understand sort of, well, are you going to let the executive director see resumes? Maybe, maybe not. Are you going to let us talk to them ahead of time before we do the hiring? Do you want them to have a meet and greet with the finalists? Like all of those steps, I think, are a possibility, but you need to be really thoughtful and understand the implications for each one. The last thing you want to do is sort of have an interview panel for potential candidate and you've asked them to evaluate and let's say a part of the operation of the organization as an exercise and the person running it is in the room, right? Like that just makes awkward conversation for everybody. So thinking through that, I think is important. And again, when they leave, make sure they don't actually stick around in some capacity. And if that's your intention, then you have to be clear in communicating that, because that will complicate things for everybody long-term. I did have an organization that was in a very tricky spot where they had a consultant that had done a lot of work for them on an interim basis. And then we hired an executive director, and the consultant just wouldn't let go of all the processes because she thought they were so complicated that people needed to take 6 months to understand the processes. And the executive director was like, I'm ready to go. And so the board had to step in and make sure that they delineated duties for everyone. So it's hard to let go sometimes too. Okay, I think a few key takeaways, and this is the point where I'm really hoping we can get some questions going. Have a plan at any point. It does not matter whether you have to use it today or tomorrow. Understand where you currently are as an organization and where you're trying to go long-term. And then executive director is really important tasks. So if you're going to hire for this role, make sure that you give it sort of the time and attention that it needs, because you have to get it right. A lot of organizations don't, and that's usually, it creates a whole bunch of issues long-term for organizations. And then the other thing is you got to talk about it. Like it's okay to talk about change. It's okay to talk about transition, but you have to allow for some space to have a discussion of, if we have to transition an executive director, how ready are we for it? My team, tells me that I'm very entertaining when it comes to metaphors, and I can come up with like the weirdest things that somehow, if you get it, you really get exactly what I'm talking about. And maybe sometimes they just are like, oh, out there. But the one example I can come up with today is, so I lived in Canada, in Toronto for a long time. And then to Maryland, just outside of DC. And so when it came to winter and how snow removal is handled, the city of Toronto used to have a policy that they would publish. It would say, we will take the snow plows out after 20 minutes of snowfall, and we will salt the roads the night before. And everybody knew, and then there was like a list of priorities. If you live on an avenue, you're going to get your street clean first. And if you live on a little cul-de-sac, you're going to have to wait last, right? So everybody knew exactly what was going to happen if it starts snowing. Now, DC, on the other hand, it snows literally twice a year, and it's always a surprise, and it's always a mess, and nobody knows what to do. And, you know, your driveway is full of snow, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I should go get some ice melt. So no plan at all most of the time. I think succession planning needs to fit somewhere on those two. And if you're in California and you have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to snow removal, that is totally okay too. But have a plan. Whether you need to execute on it or not, it's always to have it in the back pocket, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be in an emergency and a disaster when you have to do it. So this is, I think, all we have for you today. I'm really hoping you can ask some questions in the chat. If you need our help, here's how we can help you. So if you need someone to come in and write up this whole succession plan and talk to all the stakeholders and understand where all of that is, because you're busy and you're a 3-people team anyways, we're happy to come in and do that for you. Whether we also have to do the search process or as part of it or separate, that depends. Obviously, we can recruit for executive director because that's what a recruitment firm does, and that's what we've done 200 times plus. So I'm confident that we can handle that. And then if you need someone to come and talk to your board about all those things, then we can definitely help with that. Every single person on our team comes from the nonprofit space. Everybody's been on a board as well. Everybody has worked with the board. Many have reported as executive directors to the board. So we understand these dynamics inside out. We do that talk all the time. And sometimes when a consultant comes and says it, the board is a little bit more likely to believe it. So if you need some support there, and if you need someone to come and deliver the news to a board as to why these things are important, then definitely. Do we help with strategic and succession planning for our board? Yes. We can definitely handle that as well. I think many times the value that a lot of our clients appreciate about the work that we do is not only, sure, we can bring you candidates. That's part of what we do. It's the bread and butter of what we do is talk and interview people. But I think what's really important is that we get to be the people that ask your board the really hard questions that sometimes they don't really want to answer, but we will hold them accountable. And so that takes pressure off of the current executive director to having to do that. Sometimes it gives them a bit more ammo to go to the board with, here's what we need to do that. So to give you an example, executive director salary comes up all the time. And so the current executive director always has like a weird, I don't want to come across as though I'm asking for a raise myself, but I also know I'm compensated under market. And so it's a little bit easier when you hire Mariya to come in and say, hey, here's 5 other organizations in your area with similar budget, and this is what they're compensating their executive director. You're $25,000 below market. So if you need to hire a new executive director, you're going to have to come to terms with what the salary is going to differential is going to do for you. And so that sometimes helps to have those kinds of conversations externally without having to get the people in those jobs involved as well. This often happens with like the second in command or VP and C-suite roles where those are very undervalued from a salary perspective. And so what happens is the executive director has to go to the board, ask for a raise for themselves in order to open up a cap enough for us to get a raise for a VP of finance, for example, or something else. So we're happy to help because I also have surveys on top of surveys on top of surveys about every part of the country and the nonprofit space salaries there. So we come with data as well. Okay, questions. This is a good time now. And please feel free to reach out to us. Sonia on my team that's probably been communicating with you through this entire process is always available to chat with you. I'm happy to chat and sort of hear what your current needs are, whether they're on the talent recruitment side, whether they are on the succession planning side. And we're happy to help because all we do is talk to nonprofits all day long. So if you have a burning question, now is a good time to ask it. And I'm going to stop sharing so we can all see each other, hopefully. You can come off mute if you want to. You can drop it in the chat if you want to. We'll start with Sonia asking a question, maybe somebody else from my team, to buy you some time so you can think through what that question is.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So we have one question in the chat so far. So from Deirdre, I'm interested in learning more about board training and capacity building. Are there best practices you can share after the webinar?
Yeah, I mean, I can share a few resources. There's of course best practices around this. There's also a few like associations and consultants and then whatnot that do board training as sort of as a specialty as well. But typically most of the time what I've seen sort of good boards do is they would do a board training retreat. Most of the time it's once or twice a year, half day, and they would have a specific training around a topic. Most often what I get called to do, and I love doing this, is telling boards what their fundraising responsibilities are. Which it sounds simple when you say it, and like, but it's amazing with fundraising in particular. All board members have opinions and they all think they're expert and none of them want to do it. So it takes a neutral party, I think, to deliver that message to make the life of the executive director and the development director a little bit easier. So it depends on what the topic is, but that's what I've seen in terms of best practices. What doesn't work is for you to share a whole bunch of resources. They're not going to read them. So there's that too. And keeping in mind, you got to communicate whatever capacity training thing you want several times in order for it to stick. So just one session every once in a blue moon is not going to do it. It's going to be a little bit more strategic. But before you get into board training and sort of investing in that, I would say you also want to make sure that you have good terms of reference for what the board's responsibilities are. And you actually, just like you have performance and evaluation sessions for executive directors, you should probably do that with board members once a year as well. I know letting go of board members and sort of telling them they're not doing a good job sometimes can be difficult, but there are ways to do that. But I think it's important that you don't shy away from those conversations too, because the last thing you want is a board member that doesn't actually do anything.
Amazing. Thank you. And then the second question from Veronica, do you help with strategic planning or succession planning for our boards?
So to understand, do you mean when you're trying to recruit board members? We can certainly help you with things like doing a matrix of skills and like, here's what your board currently lacks or currently has. Very well. We don't usually do board recruitment specifically. I can share a few resources of folks that specialize in that. I think it really depends on the size of the organizations. Board recruitment, like firms that offer that as a service, tend to be very expensive, and they'll do this as like they would do board recruitment for like startups, for example, or corporate, and then transition into nonprofit board recruitment, which is like a totally different beast. So it may not land really well, but job descriptions and sort of that kind of stuff, we can certainly help with some of it.
Any other questions?
Sorry, I couldn't get my microphone to work, so I was just trying to expand on my question about succession planning. So the problem we're having on our board is that I'm doing board recruitment. I'm the board president, and so I joined this webinar mostly because I'm trying to have people on our board succeed me as board president. I've been there for 3 years, and so there's not a lot of interest in finding a new board president. And I'm just wondering if others have that challenge, and there's no clear exit plan, and I find it difficult. We're a small nonprofit. We really didn't plan for what would happen when my term expired, and so what do people do when they find themselves in that position? What do others do when you're like, okay, my term is expiring, I didn't really realize what I would do if the term is coming up and there's nobody else ready to succeed the role?
Yeah, I mean, so way back in the day, I used to work for universities, and in there you had some folks who were career board members, and so for them their task was, how do I get to be on the board of trustees, for example. They'd be like, okay, first I have to be on the alumni board, then I need to be the chair of the alumni board, then I need to be on this board, and then I need to be on that board, and then eventually I'll make it to the board I really want to be on. And wouldn't it be nice if everyone thought like this? But no. So I think what would help is, typically when a board chair exits, they stay on for a year or two as ex officio or member at large, or chair emerita, something like that, to help with that transition. And then if there's a board chair, there also needs to be a vice chair. And so typically, if you have a vice chair, then the assumption is that they'll become a board chair when the time comes, right? So I think probably the best thing to do is sort of recruit more board members, even if none of them are apparent board chairs right now, and think through, how do I get them there in 6 months, right? That may be the way to go. I think recruiting a board chair that's not already part of the board would be very difficult. Yeah, you could always hire a firm to help you with some of that board hiring, but succession planning for boards is no different than succession planning for executive director if you're a board that takes that seriously. I would say you could probably apply about 90% of the stuff that I just talked about today.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, we got some more questions, I think. Maybe?
Yes, we do. Let me scroll back up. Any specific advice about transition from founder-led to founder-inspired as part of succession planning more broadly?
I chuckled. So here's hard. This is difficult. We have worked on a few founder led organizations that are trying to do this. It's very difficult because like the history of the organization sometimes is very emotional, so it's difficult to transition that. Definitely a lot of attachments to relationships and donors and whatnot. I think interim executive directors really help in that case, because it gives everybody a mental and emotional switch. And the questions there really are about not so much how do you get a new leader to run the organization. The questions there are, what does the founder want to do? How do they want to be involved in really trying to get them to move on or find a different space? And some can, some can't. I've seen large organizations where the founder becomes, for example, a president of the board for a while. I've also seen founders who are pushed out of their organizations. That's a weird thing to do. But it happens. So I think one thing to do that's important is perhaps consider bringing in a consultant to do some of that succession planning that, and look, we're about to engage with an organization that's trying to do this with 2 founders, where the question is, nobody on the board feels comfortable asking them, when are you going to leave and what are you going to do after that? But they got to leave because they're in their 70s. And so, so sometimes bringing in an executive leadership coach, a succession planning expert, strategic planning, something along those lines, someone that can ask some of those questions, I think is really important. And then bringing in another staff person, even while this person is there, to start getting that information from the founders on all the things that have been going on with the organization, so that there's other sources of that information and you're not solely reliant on this person and whatever's in their heads. But it's very difficult, and usually it's hard to get it right the first time. So give it like 3 to 6 years, I would say, and 2 hires in there to make it stick, I would say. I know that's not a very positive thing, but I mean, I'm sure they happen. It's just hard. Yes, we'll share the recording later. Absolutely. I think we're at time. I'm happy to hang out for a few more minutes, but if there's any other questions, feel free to follow up with Sonia and then get on a call with us and we'll chat more about it. Thank you.